blur of diplomacy, guarded threats and competing narratives as Tehran moves to reshape the agenda of any future talks with Washington, and as capitals from Muscat to Moscow jockey to be central to the outcome. At the center of the storm is a fast-traveling Iranian foreign minister, a US president who says he holds the leverage, and a string of mediators who are trying to stitch a fragile path off a battlefield that has already widened well beyond Iran's borders. Iran's top diplomat Abbas Araghchi has spent the last several days on a three-country tour that underlines Tehran's current approach: consolidate, and insist on sequencing. He arrived in Islamabad, confer with Pakistani leaders, crossed to Muscat for a head of state meeting with Sultan Haytham bin Tariq, and then decamped for Moscow for consultations with President Vladimir Putin. The tour, Iran says, was designed to strengthen our bilateral relations and to build common and standing with neighbors and partners about how to stabilize a region now dominated by conflict and deep mistrust. At the core of Araghchi's message has been a consistent theme: the Persian Gulf, and above all, the Strait of Hormuz must be managed by the coastal states, and done so in a way that protects Iran's strategic interests. In Muscat, he reiterated the familiar but forceful line that motivates much of Tehran's diplomacy right now, declaring the secure passage through the Strait of Hormuz is currently a significant global concern. It is quite natural that we, as the two coastal nations of the strait, we must engage in discussions together so that our mutual interests can be fully secured and advanced, and we remain in complete harmony and alignment with every action taken concerning this matter. His remarks echoed throughout a series of meetings and were followed by a pledge that technical consultations would continue at the expert level with Oman, a long-time back-channel int. Abbas Araghchi also framed his tour as part of a broader diplomatic rhythm that had been briefly interrupted by the holy month of Ramadan, but which resumed as global pressure rose. The 40 days of heroic resistance by the Iranian people must absolutely ensure that we exercise our people's rights and secure the nation's interests, he told hosts and interlocutors, signaling that any concessions would be measured against domestic expectations and political realities in Tehran. The line illustrates the dual dynamic of these talks: negotiations that must be credible internationally while remaining defensible at home. Inside Iran, voices in the security apparatus have presented an even harder line. Ebrahim Azizi, who heads Parliament's Committee on National Security and Foreign Policy, delivered a blunt rejection of nuclear negotiations with the United States, coupling ideological firmness with tactical demands. There are absolutely no grounds for engaging in any negotiations with the conflict, the Americans, and of course, especially regarding the nuclear issue, he said, adding that any discussion of Iran's enrichment had to acknowledge it as an undeniable reality. Azizi's comments underscore the fractures in Tehran between those willing to test diplomacy and those who insist on red lines that cannot be crossed. Those domestic red lines appear to be shaping the negotiating framework Iran has reportedly offered behind the scenes. According to multiple accounts circulating in regional and international outlets, Tehran has presented a three-phase proposal to mediators that would reorder the sequence of talks, putting security guarantees and maritime arrangements ahead of nuclear discussions. Under that scheme, the opening phase would focus on ending what Iran calls US and Israeli aggression and securing guarantees that military action would not resume against Iran or Lebanon. Only after those guarantees would Tehran consider moving to the second phase, which would place the management of the Strait of Hormuz under a new legal architecture developed in coordination with Oman, and only after those two steps would Iran be prepared to raise the new legal file. If true, the proposal would amount to a diplomatic attempt to lock in strategic gains and maritime leverage before bargaining over the most contentious item on the table. It also makes the role of Oman and Pakistan and the influence of Moscow immediately consequential. Whether Washington is prepared to accept such sequencing will determine whether negotiations can proceed or delve into a cycle of demands and refusals. On the US side, the signals have been stark, short, and often contradictory. President Donald Trump, who returned to the White House for a second term and remains the country's commander-in-chief, has telegraphed both confidence and caution. In a series of posts and remarks that have been widely circulated, he framed the administration as holding the upper hand. "We have all the facts. Cards, they have none," he wrote on his social platform, a blunt summation of the White House posture. At the same time, he left open the mechanics of diplomacy by saying they can call us anytime they want, while also conceding a lack of a fixed strategy with the phrase, "We haven't thought about it yet." That mixture of swagger and ambivalence has complicated the work of envoys and mediators. The confusion spilled into public foreign policy theatre when President Trump abruptly cancelled a planned Pakistan visit by 2 envoys, a trip that was expected to serve as a connective tissue between the Islamabad process and Washington. The cancellation was described by the president as a matter of practicality, and his dismissive framing that the trip would be a waste of time because of internal confusion within Iran's leadership was taken by many as a sign that Washington is wary of being dragged into an agreement that would not secure all US priorities. Complicating the narrative further was a legal memorandum published in Washington in late April by the State Department's top lawyer, Reed D. Rubenstein. The memo laid out the legal rationale for the strikes the United States launched on February 28, asserting that the actions were taken in collective self-defense of an ally and invoking Article 51 of the UN Charter. The memo's bluntness drew swift reaction in Washington and beyond, because it appeared to link US military action directly to a statutory legal basis tied to defense of an ally. That same memo pushed back against claims that the decision to strike had been primarily an Israeli initiative. Israel never talked me into the war with Iran, President Trump said, defending his role and insisting that his calculus was his alone. The publication of a legal justification for cross-border military strikes has raised new questions about escalation, congressional oversight, and the limits of executive war powers. For all the competing rhetoric, the mechanics of negotiation remain messy and indirect. Iran's delegation in Islamabad was led by Parliament Speaker Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf, a figure whose background in the Revolutionary Guard and long political career give him outsized influence inside Tehran. Ghalibaf's involvement has been read by analysts as a signal that hardline security interests are at the center of any bargain, even as Araghchi and other diplomats test openings. Back channels are active. Pakistan's role as a mediator has been highlighted both by Tehran and by outside governments as crucial, while Oman quietly reasserts the role it played in previous regional arrangements by offering space and continuity. Oman's Sultan Haitham bin Tariq, who has long positioned Muscat as a discreet mediator between Tehran and Western capitals, received Araghchi in Muscat for precisely this purpose. Oman's approach is patient and incremental. Technical talks, legal frameworks, and maritime arrangements that would leave sovereign state claims intact while attempting to reduce the risk of naval confrontation in one of the world's most critical choke points. That, in turn, is seen as an immediate pressure point. The Strait of Hormuz controls the flow of a large percentage of the world's oil, and any changes to its legal status or practical management could reverberate through global shipping and energy markets. Russia's involvement adds another layer of complexity. Tehran and Moscow have deep security and economic ties, and Iran's outreach to President Putin reflects a desire to have Moscow weigh in on both guarantees and sequencing. Araghchi's meetings in Russia, where Tehran expects to pursue thorough consultations, are part of a push to bring Moscow deeper into any future settlement, whether as a guarantor, a participant, or a diplomatic amplifier. For Washington, Russian engagement is double-edged. Moscow can be a constructive partner in restraining escalation, or it can harden alliances that complicate and nair. Negotiated settlement. Domestically, Iran's political scene is both a driver and a constraint. The leadership's rhetoric about resistance and national dignity is not just posture. It translates into real constraints on what negotiating teams can accept without provoking political blowback. That is why lines like, "The 40 days of heroic resistance by the Iranian people must absolutely ensure that we exercise our people's rights and secure the nation's interests," resonate. They are both a call to unity and a warning to negotiators about the space they have to maneuver. At the same time, economic pressure, sanctions, blockades, and restrictions on exports is reshaping the calculus on both sides. There are reports that Iran's negotiators have floated unconventional economic measures, including proposals that would shift transactions into alternative currencies or bilateral settlements. In one of the more striking lines from parliamentary figures in Tehran, a demand was voiced that power The conflict must be made in Iran's national currency, the rial, a formulation that underscores how economics has become tangled with sovereignty and leverage. For clarity, Iran's currency is typically romanized as the rial. The phrasing in discussions and public statements has at times varied. Whether that kind of demand can be squared with global banks, insurance markets, and shipping companies is a practical barrier to any rapid change. The net effect of these overlapping pressures, diplomatic, military, legal, and economic, is a moment of high uncertainty. Neither Washington nor Tehran appears prepared to accept a deal that would leave the other with what it perceives to be an unacceptable advantage. At the same time, both sides have agents on the ground, intermediaries in Islamabad and Muscat, and interlocutors in Moscow who are trying to stitch together a compromise that can be presented as defensible to political constituencies at home. The immediate variables to watch are straight. Forward, will Washington accept a phased approach that prioritizes maritime and security guarantees over a first-order negotiation about nuclear limits? Will Tehran accept language that binds its hands operationally without undercutting domestic political narratives about resistance and sovereignty? Can Oman and Pakistan, with Russian support, present guarantees that are sufficiently credible for both sides? Answers to those questions will not be decided in a single meeting. They will be worked out in a sequence of shuffle diplomacy, expert-level legal drafting, and slow coalition building. And they will be measured against a simple gamble: whether keeping the Strait of Hormuz open and commercial shipping flowing can be secured without conceding parts of the nuclear and military debate that Tehran insists on non-negotiable. For now, the diplomacy is alive but fragile. Negotiators and mediators continue to move. Araghchi's travels reflect a strategy of multilateral hedging and alliance building. President Trump's administration speaks from a posture of strength while leaving open the mechanics of talks. Hardline voices in Tehran are issuing uncompromising statements intended both for foreign audiences and for domestic politics. Leaked legal memos and public cancellations of envoys' trips deepen mistrust even as middle powers try to bridge gaps. What emerges over the next days will depend on two acts: whether direct, face-to-face assurances can be crafted that satisfy both security needs and political red lines, and whether the major external players, Washington and Moscow, along with regional partners, decide that the immediate costs of inaction are worse than the risks of a negotiated settlement. Until then, the region will watch the Strait of Hormuz as both a literal choke point and a symbolic test of whether